Session 9. Sex.
Satisfy your spouse's sexual needs.
And then I go, so she knows that I'm playing with her. Then I get a little bit taller, and I grab her, and then she goes,
Aww, that's precious. Sweetheart, you want to go play in Kim's room?
Is Kim here?
No, she's at school. But you can go play anyway.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.
Hey, wait a minute. Come here. Kiss me bye.
And here you go.
Go play.
Thank you.
Don't mess with anything.
I love you.
I love you too.
She is precious.
She's a sweetie. Deb, thanks for keeping Allison again this weekend. Larry stood me up again.
Don't
we had
worry
another
about
business trip.
it. You know we love having Allison. Here, the latest. Kim's little boyfriend gave her a little love letter. So cute. We have this little romance on our hands.
Oh, yeah, it's cute when you're a kid. But when you're an adult, I think romance is dead. Men want one thing. Sex, that's it.
Lilith, I know that we don't always agree. And I know that this divorce has put you through a lot. But I want you... But I'm still your sister-in-law. And I love you. And I don't think romance has died.
It died for me a long time ago.
Would you like a cup of coffee?
Okay.
Okay. Just made a fresh pot.
Want me to help you with anything?
Yeah. Did you get the cream?
Did you know that Larry wanted to have a second child?
No.
At that time, I didn't even want to touch him anymore.
I had no idea, Lilith. With Bob and I, it's just so... Bob is just so gentle and considerate.
Don't you think I know that? I mean, I can see the way he looks at you, and the way he holds your hand, or he sneaks a kiss when he thinks nobody's looking.
Lilith,
I'd have given anything for a relationship like that.
But you and Larry must have had some
No.
good times.
No, it was never right between Larry and I. I mean, I never felt secure with Larry. I never felt smart enough. I never felt pretty enough. And the only time he was affectionate was when he wanted sex.
Well, men are different, Lilith.
That was Larry's excuse. He said that I just didn't understand a man's needs. That I made him feel guilty.
Lilith, not all men are like that.
Larry was like that. I mean, I actually tried all kinds of things to please him. Imagine that. Independent Lil trying to please her husband. But no matter what I did, it didn't seem to make any difference. I mean, what's wrong with me, Deb?
Nothing is wrong with you.
I always thought that our intimate life would be really special. and I don't know what went wrong with it.
Welcome to a biblical portrait about marriage. We're in the middle of a series right now dealing with those issues which seem to break apart marriages whenever they break apart. And of all the subjects which are the most difficult to talk about in a mixed audience, this is it. We're going to talk about sex. Something that usually you talk about when you're apart from a group. You certainly don't talk about it very often in church. But when you deal with marriage and couples and counseling like I do, that subject creeps up more times than you'll ever imagine. I've never met anybody who ever thought that they'd have a problem in sex when they got married. Somehow, that will take care of itself, and it will be wonderful. And if anything will break, it certainly will not be this problem. Nobody ever goes into marriage thinking that they'll have an affair because the sex part didn't work in their marriage. And yet it happens over and over again. Well, I want to deal tonight in this very touchy and sacred subject of sex. Is sex sinful? Is it something that you just have to do because it's a part of being human? Is it something you must endure? Is it the will of God to have sex? Is it the will of God to enjoy and get great pleasure from sex? Is it right to say to your spouse, I'm too tired to have sex tonight? Is it right to try and help your spouse have a wonderful time in the area of sex in marriage? Or is it something to hurry up and get finished? Well, those are the issues that you talk about when you counsel people on the subject of sex. It's always talked about openly, privately. And I'm going to just tell you what the Bible teaches because it's very clear. And believe it or not, it's very specific. But you know, when you start talking about the subject of sex, it can make a lot of people very uncomfortable. And some people become very much a stone face. And some people, they just want to look at the floor. Then there are those who just don't seem to take it as well as others. And in a church setting, even the most normal-looking couple, when you bring up this subject of sex, has an immediate reaction. Will you give me permission as a man, as a fellow human being, to talk about something that's very private and sensitive? Will you open yourself to that and allow me to be free to teach you what it says without being uncomfortable? Just straightforward. As if you and your spouse came in and had a problem in this area and said, will you please help us? This is what I would do. I have a number of issues I want to deal with. Number one, is sex sinful? Is it sinful? The first verse that comes to mind is in Genesis chapter 1, verses 27 and 28, where God is speaking, and in verse 28, He says to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Therefore God said, I want you to be fruitful and multiply. It's God's idea for a man and a woman who are married to have children. Therefore, God would never command something that is sinful. Sinful. Sex isn't sinful. Sex isn't Adam and Eve's idea. Sex is God's idea. And when God created things at the first couple chapters of Genesis, He said it's good, it's good, it's good, it's good. Sex is good. Sex isn't sinful. This issue of being fruitful and multiplying predated when Adam and Eve ate off the tree and sinned. Therefore, sex was God's idea before the fall. Every once in a while, I'll meet somebody that says sex is sinful because sex is what happened at the fall when they ate off the tree. Now, that is not biblical. Sex predates the fall. And it's God's idea, not man's. Now, go a little bit further on in Genesis, and you'll find the next key passage about this subject of sex in marriage. Genesis chapter 2, verse 24 and 25 says, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother, and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." This is what we've been talking about in this series. It has a number of steps. It's God's idea. He says, I want you to leave your mother and your father. I want you to cleave or hold to or cling or be with your spouse. And then I want you to become one flesh. That issue just isn't living together in the same house. In the New Testament, that passage, one flesh, is interpreted for us, and it means having sex in marriage. Is it therefore correct to leave my parents? Yes, that's biblical. Is it correct to cleave to my spouse? Yes, that's biblical. If those two are biblical, this is biblical. God wants me to leave, cleave, and just as much to have sex within marriage. This is before the fall of man. This is the will of God before there was sin in the world. But then take a look at the next verse to see something very interesting. It says, "And they were both naked, the man and his wife, and they were not ashamed." Why weren't they ashamed? Because God made all creatures at that point without clothing. And Adam and Eve were humans, and they were without clothing. And before each other, there was no self-consciousness. There was no shame. Sex wasn't seen as wrong or something to be hidden. And isn't it interesting that God makes the point of saying they were not ashamed about it? And therefore, when we take the concept that says sex is something that's shameful, hidden, we're not biblical. One other key passage I want you to see is Hebrews chapter 13, verse number 4. It says, "Marriage is honorable among all, and the bed undefiled." The Bible never uses the word like we do today, sexual intercourse. It deals with issues that are much more gentle about saying it like the bed undefiled. Well, the bed in that passage is having sex. Marriage is honorable. It's right. It's good to everyone. And what about sex in marriage? And the bed, the sexual part of your marriage, is undefiled. Literally, that Greek word means it's pure. That's literally the meaning. It has no mar to it, no dirtiness to it. There's nothing dirty about marriage, and there's nothing dirty about sex in marriage. In fact, it's not like I had dirtiness, but now it comes to just a lack of dirtiness. The Bible doesn't say that. It goes to the other side and says, no, it's pure. It's good. It doesn't go from a minus number to a 0 to a positive number. Sex in marriage is a positive purity. It's God's idea. Now, what about sex when it's not in marriage? Is it pure? Well, the next part of that verse answers the question. And it simply says, but fornicators and adulterers God will judge. In this passage, the marriage relationship is honorable to everyone, and sex within marriage is good. It's right, it's pure. But, if you have sex before marriage, which is called fornication, that's sin. In every circumstance, for every person, in every place, at every time. In fact, it's not only sinful, God will take an active part in punishing you. He will judge you for it. But what happens in marriage if you or I decide to have sex with someone else? That's called adultery. Before marriage, it's called fornication. During marriage, if you have sex with somebody else, that's called adultery. God says, I will judge you. if you do that. That is not honorable, and that is not pure. What happens if you decide to have sex with someone that's not your spouse, but is of the same sex? It's still called adultery. What happens if you have sex with somebody that's your sex? That's called homosexuality, and that is also a sin, and God will judge that as well. Therefore, the question you must ask is sex sinful? The answer is depends. With who? When? If it's not with your spouse, if it's with anybody else, it's sinful. When? If it's before you're married, it's sinful. If it's not with your person after you're married, it's sinful. But when you are married and you are having sex with the person that you're married to, you are fulfilling God's plan of one flesh, and it is good and pure. Second question I'm asked all the time, I think sex is for having kids. And after you have enough kids, I've had enough sex. So the second question is sex only for childbearing? If you had Genesis chapter 1, I want you to be fruitful and multiply, you would say to yourself, I guess that's what sex is for. The only problem is the whole rest of the Bible, whenever it talks about sex, it doesn't talk about children. It talks about your pleasure. There's a key passage in the book of Proverbs, chapter 5, verses 18, 19, and 20. This is just as much the Bible as Genesis chapter 1. And it says, let your fountain be blessed and rejoice. Now watch these words. And rejoice with the wife of your youth. As a loving deer and a graceful doe, let her breasts satisfy you at all times. All the time. Let them satisfy you. And always be enraptured with her love. You know what that Hebrew word behind enraptured literally means? It means to be intoxicated. Literally. It means to be drunk. Drunk with your wife's love. No children in this passage. It means to literally have a wonderful time in the sexual relationship with your spouse. Always. At all times. Notice there's nothing said about children here. When you take a look at the Bible and you say, where would you go in the Bible to find the most about sex in marriage? Do you know there's a whole book about this in the Bible? In fact, the Jewish rabbis wouldn't allow a man to read the book until he was 30. Because in the original language of Hebrew, it is so explicit and so sexual that it is surprising. It's called the Song of Solomon. And it is a sexual book. Let me just read a couple verses out of Song of Solomon. Song of Solomon, chapter 2. I am the rose of Sharon and the lily of the valleys. Like a lily among thorns, so is my love among the daughters. Like an apple tree among the trees of the woods, so is my beloved among the sons. I sit down in his shade with great delight, and his fruit was sweet to my taste. He brought me to the banqueting table, and his banner, my husband's banner, over me was love. Sustain me with cakes of raisins, refresh me with apples, for I am lovesick. His left hand is under my head, and his right hand embraces me. Tender, compassionate, romantic. She's talking about her beloved. And she does it with words that are rather surprising. She says, his head is as most fine gold. And his locks are bushy and black as ravens. His eyes are as the eyes of doves. His cheeks are as a bed of spices. As sweet flowers are his lips like lilies, dropping sweet-smelling myrrh. And his beloved? Well, listen to how he describes her. Thy hair is a flock of goats that appear from Mount Gilead. Thy teeth are like a flock of sheep that are even shorn. Thy lips, O my spouse, drop as the honeycomb. And like young deer are your... We better not describe that any farther. Song of Solomon. Some of you are going to want to go home and read that tonight. Now, if it's not sinful and it's not just for childbearing, then I have a very significant question for you. What is God's perfect will regarding your sex life in marriage? How do you glorify God with sex? Can you? What is the will of God? How should I, as a husband, think about sex as a man in my marriage? How should my wife think about sex as my wife in marriage? 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse number 2. And it says this, Nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. Let the husband render to his wife the affection due her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. Verse number 4, the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and to prayer, and come together again, so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Let's take a look at these verses carefully. I want to give you some principles. Principle number 1 is in verse number 2. It says, Nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, something should be done. Let each man have his own wife. Let each woman have her own husband. If you want to deal with the question of what is God's primary solution for the temptation to sexual immorality, which is everywhere, you know what God's primary solution is? Your spouse. That everywhere you look in Scripture about how not to be sexually immoral, God always brings it back to your spouse and you. Because of the temptations that are outside you, and because of the God-given sexual drive inside of you to have sex, get married. Have your own wife. That the primary way to deal with sexual immorality is that all of your sex drives are met by your very own spouse. And therefore the drive to be immoral with somebody else outside of marriage is not there very much. Because that need, that drive, has been acceptably met in marriage. Because of sexual immorality, let everybody have their own spouse. Therefore, if the statistics are right, and the majority of all married people have affairs after they're married, I would dare say that biblically speaking, the reason for it is their sexual relationship in marriage is not meeting their sexual needs. Because of sexual immorality, let each person have their own spouse. If I've heard it once, I've heard it 100 times. I don't get it at home, I'm going. Because my needs weren't met in my marriage, I will meet my needs somewhere else. God says, it's because of that that you have a spouse. Principle number two. Principle number two. It's in verse number 3. Let the husband render to his wife the affection due her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. Second principle. God commands you to fulfill your spouse's sexual needs. Commands. The verse says, let the husband render to the wife. You know what that word render actually means? It is to give back. And it's an imperative. See, when you and I become married, we share our vows with our partner to love and to care till death do us part. And the second you and I become married, now listen to this carefully. This is what this verse says. The second I say I do, I have a debt. I have a debt I owe to my spouse. And that debt is an imperative. I am commanded to meet the sexual needs of that person. It is a debt that I have to pay. How do I know if the debt's been paid? You ask the person who you owe it to. It's not that I pay the debt as far as what I think it is. Has your sexual needs been met to your satisfaction, to your happiness, to your fulfillment? That's the debt. And I am to give it to her. And you are to give it to your spouse. It's not an option. It's an obligation. It's an obligation. How should I feel about this? Well, look at verse number 3. Let the husband render to his wife the affection due her. Concept is, when God commands me to fulfill my spouse's sexual needs, I am to do it with a tender, affectionate attitude. It's the concept of affection. It's not, well, I have to, and you want to, okay. I am your spouse. The word affection means loyalty, tender, careful. I am obligated and commanded to meet my spouse's sexual needs. Listen to me carefully. By their definition, not by my definition. And I am to fulfill them in a way that is affectionate to the person. It's not have a sense of obligation alone. It brings in the concept of my affection and how I feel and how I express myself in the same issue. Number 4 is in verse number 4. It says, the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. God, listen to this principle. God delegates in this verse your right to your body to your spouse for the purpose of sexual pleasure. That word authority, the wife does not have authority, it means God, literally, came to the wife, took away her right to her body, and took it away from her, and gave it to her husband. Here, you now have her body. Why? Why would God give the husband his wife's body and the wife her husband's body? Answer, they need it because of the sex drive that God gave to them. What happens if she doesn't want to? Because her body is tired and mine isn't. What should she do? Answer, she has no right to her body. That's what that verse says. I have no authority over this body. It is for my wife's pleasure. Your body is for your husband's pleasure. What happens if your spouse wants to have sex a lot? Fine. That is irrelevant. You have an obligation, according to Scripture, and I do, to be affectionate and to meet the needs of that person's sexual drive as much, as frequent, as often, or as seldom as that person desires it, because your body has been delegated by God to your spouse. No authority. No right. If she asks to have sex, the answer is always yes. Of course. If he asks to have sex, of course. We treat our bodies as if they're ours. They are not, according to God. This body is His, God's, and He tells me it's also my spouse's. And it's for her pleasure. Is this just a little bit clear? Verse number 5. Do not deprive one another except with consent. Next principle. God only gives one, listen to me, God only gives one biblical reason not to have sex. Only one. Do you know what it is? With consent. Do you know what that word consent is in the Greek language? It means symphony. It means there's complete, unanimous agreement. Husband and wife, together, let's not have sex for a season for this reason. That's the only reason that you or I can deprive each other, and I'm not really depriving because you don't want to have it now either. The word there, deprive, means to default. It means to steal and rob the person. Do not ever say no. Except you both agreed not to. So you're not really saying no. Something very, very helpful is number 6 in the principle. Look at verse 5, 1 Corinthians 7. Do not deprive one another except with consent. And then it tells you for a time, just for a period of time you agree upon, that you can give yourselves to fasting and prayer. And come, now watch, this is God's will here, and come together again, which means to come together how? Have sex again. You stopped, you both agreed to, for whatever reason you had, but then come back and have sex again. Why? Why? So that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Here's the last principle in this passage. God warns of unnecessary and satanic sexual temptation if sex is denied. God warns of unnecessary and satanic temptation if sex is denied. So that Satan does not tempt you because he's going to tempt you because you got a need to have sex. And if that's not meant with the person that you're married to, he knows that, you know that, and he's going to tempt you. That's unnecessary. Come together. And there's nothing there to tempt. Is there a normal temptation from the inside? Yes, there is, of course. But there's also a temptation from Satan. And if you deny the sexual needs of each other so long that your drive is not being met and it is beginning to irritate and frustrate, Satan moves in and it's all unnecessary. And the person who denied the sex to the other person is causing them to be tempted. If a man's wife wants to have sex and he is ticked off at her and decides to get back to her, at her, by not having sex, and just gets hard, and the days go by, and the weeks go by, that woman's going to have some unnormal temptations. Bible's real clear. Number one way not to have sexual immorality is have wonderful sex with your spouse as often as you want it. But what about me? What am I supposed to do about my sex drive? Should I let her know? Should I expect her to figure it out? What am I supposed to do with the way God made me and the way God made you? What am I supposed to do on the receiving side? Should I hold back, really? What really should you do? Glad you asked. The Bible's got a clear answer. It's in 1 Thessalonians, chapter 4, verse number 3. For this is the will of God, your sanctification. What is my sanctification? That you should abstain from sexual immorality. That each of you should know how to possess his own vessel in sanctification and honor, not in passion of lust like the Gentiles who do not know God. That no one should take advantage of and defraud his brother in this matter, because the Lord is the avenger of all such. And we also forewarned you and testified. For God did not call us to uncleanness, but to holiness. Therefore, he who rejects this does not reject man, but God, who has given us his Holy Spirit. Take a look at verse number 3. It is the will of God, your sanctification. What is my sanctification equal to? My sanctification is that I should abstain from sexual immorality. I stop this. Principle number 1, it's God's will never to have any sex outside of marriage at any time to anyone. This is my responsibility. Number 2, it's my responsibility to always abstain from immoral temptation. That word where it says, you should abstain from sexual immorality, that's in the middle voice in the language. It means hold yourself back from sexual temptation. It's my responsibility to abstain. It's my wife's responsibility, and vice versa, to meet her sexual needs in marriage. But even when she is, or even if she's not, and a sexual temptation comes, I have a simple responsibility. Abstain. Hold back yourself. Stop. Third principle, is in verse number 4. That each of you should know how to possess his own vessel in sanctification and honor. This is a very important one. It's your responsibility to figure out how to handle your own sex drive. not your spouse's problem. It's yours. It says that each one of you should know. And that word know literally means to perceive it, through experience it. Know how to do it. How do you possess it? Do you have a weak sex drive? A songs? What are you like? When is it most important to you that you ought to know? It's your responsibility. Figure it out. When I'm with ministers and just men are together, and we get into the nitty-gritties of staying pure in ministry, I will always tell these guys, make sure you have sex before you leave on a trip. Every man in the group goes, you know how? You know. You know. It's my responsibility. It's your responsibility. But then it says that each one of you should know how to possess his own vessel in sanctification and in honor. This concept of possess, it means how do you hold it? How do you fulfill it? How do you make it work for you? It's my responsibility to take leadership in the marriage. It's your responsibility to take leadership in the marriage, to tell your partner what it's going to take for your sexual drive to be fulfilled. I have to know how to possess my vessel. It's my job. And I'm the one who must take responsibility to share that to my spouse. Somehow we think that there is this automatic knowledge that goes on that the other person can automatically read our mind. Or they should pick it up. You have to know, and you have to take the initiative. If you're a man or you're a woman. And you have to find a way that is pleasing inside of your marriage to take the initiative to let the other person know what you're trying to say. We have one couple friends that the lady will put a candle on the nightstand. Anytime he comes in a room and sees the candle, he knows it's going to be hot time tonight. What's your method? Most couples we know don't have one. Do you know how many times the couples therefore break this principle? That they go to bed, one of them saying, how come they didn't know? How come they didn't pick it up? Other person didn't even know. Find your way to possess your vessel in honor and sanctification so that it is workable. It happens. Therefore, I have a couple questions for you as we close tonight. Question number 1. If I were to ask your spouse, how much does your spouse meet your sexual needs? What would they say? How content? How much do you enjoy? How fulfilled are you? What would they say? And have you released yourself? Have you released your body and your affections so that whenever you pick up the need of your spouse, you take responsibility and move in and, if I'm just going to say it biblically, pour on pleasure to your spouse. You pour it on. So that when that night is over, your spouse is saying, that was wonderful. Thank you for loving me like that. You mean like that? Yes. Wholeheartedly? Yes. It's interesting, if you ask a man what he receives most pleasure in all of life, he will always answer the same. If he's honest. Number 1, sex. God made all men like that. If you ask a woman, all the studies I've read, and I read about 30 different books, parts of books, getting ready for tonight. The sex issue in Drive in a Woman isn't number 1 or number 2 or number 3. Intimacy is number 1. The feeling of closeness. The feeling of being loved and cared for. And the candlelight and the flowers and the softness and the embrace and the tenderness is what she's looking for. Both of those are made by God. And ladies, the challenge God gives to you is your husband should be the most contented, happy, loved. And the woman that winks at him at the office, he should have so many memories. And know he can wait, because when he goes home and lets you know, he has no need to have sex with somebody else. You're the best there is for him. And husbands, let me ask you a question. Is your wife radiant and feel content and loved and hugged and cared for? So that no matter who pays attention to her, the temptation is almost of no effect to her because she has those needs met. Is it sinful? No. Is it just for children? No. Is it something you just have to do? No. What is it? It may be the most important thing a wife may do for her husband. Ladies. So put it the priority that your spouse would like it to be.
I will always love you.
Oh, that was wonderful. I just love those romantic movies. Well, I think I'll go on upstairs to bed.
You're not tired, are you?
Oh, well, a little bit.
But, I could be right upstairs as soon as I lock up.
I have a splitting headache.
Not really.
No. Not really.
Hey, I could lock up tomorrow. Or later. I could lock up later.
Okay. I'm coming.